Welcome back, guys. This is video 3 of the chapter 23 lecture. I did a really bad job of trying to explain this at the end of the last video, so I'm gonna take a second shot at it. So intrasexual selection is where members of one gender, often males, are going to compete for mates of the opposite gender. Intersexual selection, really similar, is where the members of one gender are choosy in selecting their mates. So these two things often are happening at the same time. The female is choosing, the males are competing. So maybe we're talking about who has the best mating dance, who is the biggest, strongest, fastest. It depends on what the species is, on what they choose. So how do their preferences involved? Well, there's a hypothesis that suggests that if a trait is related to a male quality, both the male trait and a female preference for that trait increase in frequency. So if there's something that makes me manly, that should make me a better mate. And theoretically, if that makes me a better mate, then my genes increase in frequency over time. So there's some experiments, some data that show that females select based on traits that show quote-unquote good genes. Check out their mating call. This is the experiment. So this frog has a longer mating call than does this one. So that suggests that they have more good genes. We'll talk more about that experiment in class. Once again, I did a poor job explaining that. So balancing selection is essentially where we're going to have stability. So we're going to have, think of stabilizing selection. That's sort of the idea that we're talking about here. Frequency dependent selection and heterozygote advantage are two things that we're going to talk about on upcoming slides. So here's frequency dependent. It's essentially the fitness of the phenotype depends on how common it is. So like you're seeing there, right mouth and left mouth scale eating fish. That's an example from your book. Here's a graph that shows basically we're talking about suckerfish, right? And so which side do they swim on? And the more prevalent phenotype is more desirable. Sort of the idea that we want to fit in. We want our mates to look like our friends' mates and things like that. So the heterozygote advantage messes with all selection. It could be something like malaria, where if you're a heterozygote, for sickle cell, you don't carry malaria. You're not at risk for malaria. So that means that the heterozygote is more fit than is homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. I talked about the malaria one, so we should be good. We should be good there. Here's a picture from your book that talks about folks that have sickle cell and folks that have normal red blood cells. If you notice, the sickle cell doesn't carry oxygen very well. The regular cell does, normal cell. Sorry, let's zoom in a little bit. Oh, sorry, that doesn't zoom in. So the side effect is that malaria also can't be carried, just like the oxygen can't be carried. So if we look here, we've got concentrations of malaria in areas where there are lots of mosquitoes. What a surprise. We don't have a lot of malaria in northern Russia or over here in Australia, which you can't really see. Or in, sorry, here, that's not Australia, that's, excuse me, that's India, that's China, Japan, Australia would be right around here. But we see a lot of individuals with sickle cell in places where there are lots of malaria. Those folks that are heterozygotes don't have to worry about malaria. So we see those two things kind of competing. So natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms because it's not goal-oriented. Only acts on existing variations. We're limited by historical constraints. If we don't have those alleles, we can't just spontaneously mutate them. Adaptations are often compromises. They're things that we do currently, but we just do them a little bit better. They're not an ideal situation. I talked earlier about In fact, if I move to Antarctica, I might grow more hair on my arms and on my legs and things like that, but I'm not going to suddenly sprout snowshoe feet. I'm not going to be covered in hair like a Yeti or something like that. So I'm just sort of compromising as an adaptation. And then if that's a genetic trait, maybe I can pass that on. If it's not a genetic trait and it doesn't happen in my gamete producing cells, I can't pass that on. And then of course chance, natural selection, and the environment are all going to interact. The climate changes and everything changes. Last thing on this video is I want to really, really, really strongly encourage you to be able to answer the questions that revolve around this image. Really strongly want to encourage you to look at that. I'm not going to help you a lot with it, but I want you to take some time, look at what we're talking about here, look at our allele frequencies, look at how the environment is impacting, specifically how the salinity in the environment is impacting the genetics of this organism. So that's the end of chapter 23. Make sure you've also seen the Hardy-Weinberg flip.